picture this. It's early 2011, and a private jet is diving into this stomach-churning corkscrew descent toward Benghazi, Libya.
Right into a war zone.
Exactly. You look out the window of this tiny plane and you see these columns of black smoke rising from a raging civil war. And escorting this jet through the hostile airspace is a lone NATO drone.
It's just wild.
Yeah, and inside the cabin sits a guy named Ian Taylor. He's heading straight into this chaos to strike a deal with a ragtag rebel army. This army has absolutely no cash, but they desperately need fuel to survive.
I mean, it sounds like a scene ripped straight out of a Hollywood thriller, but this actually happened. Ian Taylor was the CEO of Vitol, which is, a massive oil trading giant.
Gripped.
Yeah, and he was flying in to offer $1 billion lifeline of fuel to the Libyan rebels in exchange for a promise of future crude oil. He was effectively betting his entire company on the outcome of a violent revolution.
Which is crazy when you think about it.
Completely. He was stepping in to act as a financier and supplier where sovereign governments and traditional banks simply could not or would not go.
And that perfectly sets up the mission of our deep dive today. We're exploring excerpts from the book The World for Sale to uncover the shadow economy of commodity traders. We really want to shine a massive spotlight on these invisible middlemen who quietly buy and sell the Earth's natural resources.
But before we dive into the deep end, it is crucial to note that our source material touches on some highly sensitive, historically complex geopolitical events.
Right, definitely.
Throughout this discussion, we'll be looking at actions taken during the Cold War, the Arab Spring, and the apartheid regime in South Africa. And we want to be entirely explicit with you. We are impartially reporting the facts exactly as they are presented in the book. We're not taking any political sides, nor are we endorsing any of the viewpoints or actions we discuss.
Yeah, our goal is simply to unpack the historical reality of these traders and understand how they operated in these extremely volatile environments. Okay, let's unpack this, because we are not talking about the big household name oil or mining companies here. When you think of oil, you think of Exxon or BP. But these independent trading houses are a completely different beast, aren't they?
They really are. They operate with a level of extreme secrecy that would make an intelligence agency jealous. I mean, they manage staggering amounts of wealth, and historically, they've shown an almost total disregard for political borders or ideologies. To them, the world is just one giant logistics puzzle.
So why should anyone listening care about a bunch of secretive middlemen?
Because it matters to you directly. Whether you are filling up your gas tank to commute to work or buying a new smartphone, or simply using a sheet of aluminum foil to wrap up your dinner leftovers, you are participating in a global market.
A market they built.
Yes. That market was fundamentally shaped and in many ways is still controlled by the swashbuckling traders we are about to discuss.
Where does a shadow industry like this even begin, though, if we aren't talking about the standard corporate giants who built the system?
To really understand them, we have to rewind to the 1950s. The post-World War II global boom is in full swing. The world is slowly transitioning into a single massive market.
Right.
And during this time, a new breed of globe-trotting networkers steps up to connect the dots. They saw the entire world as their playing field, operating in an era before globalization was even a recognizable concept.
So who is the pioneer here? Who was the first person to look at the world this way?
A great example from the source material is a German man named Theodor Weiser. In 1954, he's running a struggling fuel distributor called Mabanaft. He realizes he desperately needs new sources of oil to keep his business afloat, so he decides to travel to Moscow.
Wait, Moscow. In 1954, that is the absolute freezing point of the Cold War.
Exactly. And it gets crazier. Weiser was a former German soldier who had actually been a prisoner of war under the Soviets. He was so utterly terrified of being recognized on the streets of Moscow that he bought a bright red cap and pulled it down over his eyes for the entire trip.
That is wild. He's literally sneaking into enemy territory wearing a disguise just to find oil. Did it work?
It did. He gets there, sits down for a tense dinner under the watchful eyes of the KGB, and somehow manages to strike the very first independent oil deal with the Soviets.
Wow!
Yeah, he bypassed the massive Western corporate oligopoly known as the Seven Sisters completely. He opened a crack in the Iron Curtain purely for profit.
So he just completely bypassed the biggest corporations on Earth.
He did. Now, he faced massive backlash back home, obviously. Western shipping companies initially refused to even work with him. But he proved a concept that became the golden rule for commodity traders. Commerce always trumps ideology.
If commerce always trumps ideology, how did that play out as the Cold War escalated? I imagine the Soviets needed a lot more than just a buyer for their oil.
They absolutely did, and that brings us to 1972 and a truly unbelievable situation involving the agricultural trading giant Cargill. That year, the Soviet crops had failed miserably, and Moscow was desperate to avoid mass starvation. So they send a drab, unassuming Soviet bureaucrat named Nikolai Belousov to New York.
Let me guess, he didn't just walk into a supermarket. What was his mission?
In total secrecy, Belousov starts visiting multiple Western grain traders in different hotel rooms across the city. He met with Continental Grain, Louis Dreyfus, Bunge, and Cargill. He negotiated massive, unprecedented purchases with all of them. In total, this single bureaucrat bought nearly 30% of the entire U.S. wheat harvest in one swoop.
Hold on, 30% of the entire country's harvest? How did nobody notice one guy buying up a third of the U.S. food supply?
What's fascinating here is that these trading companies were so intensely secretive and so obsessed with hiding their own moves from their competitors that none of them knew Belousov was also buying from their rivals.
You're kidding.
Nope. They all sold him grain they didn't even physically own yet, assuming they could just quietly buy it cheaply on the open market later to fulfill their contracts with him.
So they all basically sold him invisible wheat, thinking they were the only ones on the deal. What happens when they all go to the market at the same time to actually buy the physical grain?
Complete chaos. When the market finally woke up to the sheer scale of what the Soviets had bought, there simply wasn't enough grain to go around. It triggered massive food inflation across the United States.
I can imagine.
The price of wheat tripled. Meat prices shot up because animal feed became too expensive. The American public was absolutely outraged, and the media dubbed it the Great Grain Robbery.
That sounds like a disaster for everyone involved. Did the traders take a massive hit?
Not at all. They made out like bandits. Cargill's Swiss arm, a unit called Trade Axe, realized what was happening just before the rest of the market did. They placed massive speculative bets that global prices would rise. They made over $60 million that year.
Which was huge back then.
Yes, that was more than massive corporate giants like Boeing were making at the time.
So extreme secrecy, combined with a willingness to capitalize on a global crisis, became their winning formula.
Precisely. And that blueprint takes us directly into the chaotic oil markets of the 1970s and the rise of the most famous, or perhaps infamous, commodity trader of them all, Marc Rich.
I've heard that name. How did he get his start?
He started his career sorting mail at a metals trading firm called Philip Brothers. Rich was the ultimate outsider, intensely driven, and insanely hardworking.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because I know he effectively invented the independent oil trade as we know it today, but he did it using a secret 42-inch pipeline that ran from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean.
Yes.
Wait, a secret pipeline? A 42-inch pipeline is a massive piece of infrastructure. How do you keep something like that a secret, and who even built it?
It was the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline, and it was built jointly by Israel and Iran. Even back then, they were strange bedfellows, united only by mutual economic interests. The pipeline was a clandestine operation designed to bypass the Suez Canal, which had been blocked due to geopolitical conflict with Egypt.
So how did Marc Rich actually use it to trade oil?
It was incredibly stealthy. Iranian tankers would tell port authorities they were sailing to Gibraltar, but once they were out at sea, they'd secretly divert to Israel, unload their oil into this pipeline, and reappear completely empty back in the Persian Gulf. The press at the time called it the mystery of the disappearing tankers. Marc Rich used this exact pipeline to quietly funnel Iranian oil all over Europe, making huge profits.
The timing of this had to be perfect. The 1970s was when the entire global power dynamic around oil flipped upside down, right?
It was a violent shift. The OPEC nations began nationalizing their oil resources, meaning those Western corporate giants, the Seven Sisters, suddenly lost their iron grip on the world's supply. Then, the 1973 Yom Kippur War triggered a massive global oil embargo. The official price of oil jumped almost overnight from $3.29 a barrel to $11.58.
That kind of price shock must have created utter panic in the markets. Where was Marc Rich when this happened?
Rich and his partner, Pinky Green, had actually secured a massive contract for Iranian oil just before that price spiked. They knew the market was going to explode, but their boss at Philip Brothers, a very conservative man named Ludwig Jesselson, panicked. He forced them to sell the contract early because he thought holding it was far too risky without a guaranteed buyer lined up in advance.
Oh no, he forced them to sell right before the biggest price spike in history.
Yes, It was a decision that cost the firm tens of millions of dollars in potential profits when the embargo hit and prices skyrocketed.
Yeah.
Rich was absolutely furious. He demanded a $1 million bonus from Jesselson for the massive profits he did manage to bring in despite the early sale. Jesselson, who saw his traders as mere employees rather than equal partners, flat out refused.
I'm guessing Marc Rich didn't just accept that and go back to his desk.
Not a chance. In 1974, Rich walked out. He took his core team and formed Marc Rich plus Co., which rapidly became the most dominant, aggressive trading house of the era. And his departure perfectly timed the rise of the Rotterdam spot market.
The wild casino.
Exactly. With OPEC now controlling the oil but lacking the vast distribution networks of the old Western companies, Rotterdam became that casino. Prices fluctuated wildly every single day based on supply, demand, and sheer panic. You had figures like the flamboyant John Deuce treating oil trading like a geopolitical game of roulette.
So the traders became the new masters of the universe. What did they do with all that power and wealth as we move into the 1980s?
They took on an entirely new role. They effectively became shadow banks. They started stepping in to finance struggling emerging markets where traditional Wall Street banks and the International Monetary Fund wouldn't dare tread. They became the last bank in town for desperate nations.
Give me an example of how that actually works. A country doesn't just walk into a trading firm and ask for a loan, do they?
It's actually much more dramatic than that. Let's look at Jamaica. It's a Friday night. Hugh Hart, Jamaica's mining minister, gets word from his central bank that the country is completely bankrupt. They cannot raise the $10 million needed to pay for an incoming oil shipment, and the entire country will literally run out of gas by Sunday. Total economic and social collapse is hours away. Desperate, he calls Marc Rich in Switzerland, waking him up at 2 a.m.
You're telling me a sovereign nation's minister was treating a commodity trader like a 911 dispatcher? How did Rich react to being woken up like that?
Initially, he's annoyed. He essentially tells the minister, "What do you expect me to do about it? Your central bank is broke," and he hangs up the phone. But within an hour, a massive tanker of Venezuelan crude that Rich controlled was diverted to Kingston, Jamaica.
Wait, so he just sent millions of dollars of oil to a bankrupt country without a contract?
There was no signed contract, just a handshake over a late-night phone call to save a nation from ruin. But it wasn't charity. That 2 a.m. favor bought Marc Rich plus Co. incredible, unshakable loyalty and access, because Jamaica happened to be one of the world's largest producers of bauxite and alumina, which are the raw materials needed to make aluminum.
Ah, so they trade a short-term favor for long-term access to a totally different, highly valuable resource.
Exactly. Marc Rich's right-hand man, Manny Weiss, used this deep relationship with the Jamaican government to secure dirt-cheap Jamaican alumina. And he used those secure physical supplies to place massive bets on the financial markets. In 1988, Weiss practically cornered the global aluminum market.
Okay, I need an ELI 5 here. Explain cornering the market to me like I'm 5. What does that actually mean in practice?
Think of it like a highly anticipated concert. If you somehow buy up 90% of all the tickets to that concert, and people absolutely must attend, you can charge whatever you want for the remaining tickets, because you control the supply.
Got it.
Weiss essentially did that with physical aluminum. He bought up so much of the available supply that anyone who had signed a contract promising to deliver aluminum to someone else suddenly couldn't find any metal to buy.
So if I'm a rival trader and I promise to deliver a ton of aluminum next week, and Weiss owns it all, I have to go to him and pay whatever outrageous price he demands.
Yes. Prices quadrupled from their lows. There simply wasn't enough aluminum in the official London Metal Exchange warehouses to satisfy the futures contracts. Desperate buyers who had bet the wrong way were actually chartering private jumbo jets to fly raw metal across the Atlantic Ocean just to get it into the warehouses in time to meet their legal obligations. Weiss and Marc Rich plus Co. made an absolute fortune.
That is brilliant, but it also highlights a very dark reality about this industry. This commerce over ideology approach means they will deal with literally anyone, regardless of the human cost, right?
That is the amoral reality of the business. During the apartheid era in South Africa, there was a strict global international oil embargo against the regime. The government there was heavily reliant on oil imports, and without them, the apartheid economy would have collapsed. But traders like Marc Rich made billions stepping in to supply the racist regime when no one else would.
How did they even get away with that? An international embargo means everyone is watching.
They went to extreme lengths to hide their tracks. They use secret codes in their communications, calling South Africa Tulip or Udo in their telexes. They even ordered ship captains to physically paint over the names of their massive tankers or cover the identifying markers with canvas to avoid being tracked by international monitors.
That sounds like straight-up smuggling.
It was. But perhaps the most audacious example of this was a scheme known as Kobuko. Marc Rich plus Co. set up a completely fake company in a chic office in Brussels. They literally pretended it was a state-owned entity of Burundi, which is an impoverished, landlocked nation in Africa.
Oh, way.
They even hired a European trader to sit in the office and answer the phone under the fake name Monsieur Ndolo.
Hold on. They rented an office in Belgium and just pretended to be an African country? How does that even work? What was the point?
The goal was to secure cheap, interest-free oil from Iran. The revolutionary government in Tehran at the time was offering highly favorable terms to poor, non-aligned African nations as a geopolitical gesture of solidarity. So Marc Rich's fake company applied for this cheap oil on behalf of Burundi.
Let me guess. The oil never went anywhere near Burundi.
Not a single drop. The paperwork claimed the shipments were heading to a refinery in Kenya to be trucked overland to Burundi. In reality, the ships went straight on to the global spot market and frequently directly to South Africa, sold at a massive markup.
So they're pocketing the profit from selling it to an embargoed nation. But what about the money they owed Iran?
Because Iran gave Burundi 2-year interest-free payment terms as charity, Rich took the massive pile of cash from his quick sales and invested it in high-yield money markets for 2 years. He netted $42 million purely on the interest from the delayed payment. The impoverished people of Burundi, whose name was used to secure the deal, saw absolutely nothing.
That is staggering. So they are moving physical oil, faking documents, and playing geopolitics. But as we move into the late 1980s and 1990s, the market shifts again, right? We enter the era of financialization.
Yes, this is when the hotshots of Wall Street truly collided with the gritty oil industry. And it started in a very unexpected way. The NYMEX exchange in New York, which handled commodities trading, had suffered a massive, highly embarrassing default in, of all things, potato futures.
Potato futures?
Yes. They were desperate for a new, glamorous product to save the exchange's reputation, so they pivoted heavily into oil futures in 1983. This changed the fundamental nature of the industry forever. Suddenly, you didn't need to physically own a barrel of oil or charter a massive ship to trade. You could trade paper barrels.
Okay, another ELI 5 moment. What exactly is a paper barrel or a futures contract in this context?
Let's use an analogy. Imagine you are a farmer growing apples. You are worried that by the time your apples are ready to harvest in 6 months, the price will crash. So you sign a contract today with a grocery store, agreeing to sell them your apples in 6 months at a locked-in price of $1 each. You've transferred your risk to the grocery store.
Yeah.
That contract is a future.
Makes sense.
In the oil market, traders realized they could buy and sell these contracts, these paper promises, without ever intending to touch a physical drop of oil.
So it allowed for massive speculation without the messy logistics of actual tankers. Who was the king of this new era?
A man named Andy Hall, who worked for Fibro Energy. He was an absolute master of this new financialized market. In early 1990, Hall believes the physical oil market is oversupplied and prices are going to drop. But interestingly, the futures market is pricing oil much higher 6 months out. So he executes a masterstroke.
What does he do?
He runs a massive flotilla of VLCCs, very large crude carriers. He buys millions of barrels of cheap physical oil, fills the ships, and literally just parks them out at sea. Simultaneously, he sells futures contracts, locking in that higher price for 6 months from now. He basically bought the oil for $15 today and instantly signed a legally binding contract to sell it in 6 months for $20. The profit was locked in stone. He was completely insulated from risk.
So he's just sitting on $600 million worth of oil floating in the ocean, waiting for the calendar to turn so he can collect his guaranteed profit.
Exactly. But then Saddam Hussein starts threatening Kuwait. Hall reads the increasingly aggressive rhetoric coming out of Iraq and makes a gut-wrenching decision. He drops his hedges.
Meaning he cancels those futures contracts.
He buys them back, yes. He strips away his financial insurance and goes completely exposed. He is now betting everything that a war will break out and send physical prices skyrocketing. If he's wrong and prices drop, he loses a fortune. And at 1 a.m. on August 2nd, 1990, he gets the call from his Tokyo office. Iraqi tanks have crossed the border into Kuwait.
And the market explodes.
Oil prices doubled in a matter of months. Hall's unhedged physical oil sitting on those ships became an absolute gold mine because he took that massive, uninsulated gamble. Fibro Energy made up to $800 million from that single geopolitical crisis.
But playing with paper barrels and stripping away insurance has to be incredibly dangerous, right? Can't always work out perfectly.
It was a double-edged sword that brought unprecedented volatility to the market. When the U.S. launched Operation Desert Storm in January 1991, the market quickly realized the war would be over very soon and Iraqi forces would be crushed. Prices crashed 35% in a single day. Andy Hall lost $100 million overnight. The days of predictably controlling the market with physical assets were gone forever.
So what does this new chaotic financial era mean for the undisputed king of the physical industry, Marc Rich? How does he fare in the 1990s?
The 1990s were the beginning of the end for his empire. Rich was now a fugitive. He had fled to Switzerland to escape the largest tax evasion indictment in U.S. history, brought by federal prosecutors in New York.
Being an international fugitive has to put a damper on your ability to run a global trading firm.
It absolutely did. Isolated in the quiet town of Zug, Switzerland, Rich becomes deeply paranoid. He walls himself off from his top traders, forcing them to communicate with him through his Texas lawyer, Bob Tomajan. He stops treating his top guys like trusted partners and starts treating them like replaceable vassals. And crucially, his legendary trading instincts began to fail him.
What was the breaking point?
In 1992, he backed a disastrous attempt to corner the global zinc market. It backfired spectacularly when the metal exchange intervened and major producers simply started selling more zinc. The price plummeted, and the firm lost $172 million. Suddenly, the firm was hit with relentless margin calls.
Margin call. I hear that term thrown around in finance movies all the time. In this specific context, what does a margin call actually mean for the guys sitting in the office?
It means the exchange where they place their bets is essentially calling them up and saying, your bets are losing rapidly. We no longer trust that you can pay up. You need to wire us tens of millions of dollars in cold, hard cash right this second to prove you are good for it, or we liquidate your positions. These margin calls were draining the company's cash reserves daily. The finance guys at Marc Rich Plus Co. are literally pulling their hair out, hosting emergency meetings asking, how do we pay the basic bills tomorrow?
So what does this all mean? That kind of extreme vulnerability combined with Rich's paranoia sounds like a recipe for a mutiny.
And that's exactly what happened. In 1993, the top traders, Claude Dauphin, Willie Strauthot, and Manny Weiss, had finally had enough. They staged a boardroom coup. They issued an ultimatum to Rich: step down and sell your controlling stake, or we all walk right now and start our own firm, leaving you with nothing.
Did Rich fight back? He doesn't seem like the type to just hand over the keys.
He tried to renegotiate, to delay, to play them against each other, because he's a traitor, down to his DNA. But the trust was fundamentally broken. He was ultimately forced to sell his shares at a massive discount, walking away in defeat from the empire he had built from scratch.
So what happens to the company after they kick out the founder?
This is one of the most incredible pivots in business history. To buy Rich out and scrub his highly toxic, federally indicted name from the building, Willie Strauthot secured a $150 million lifeline from a very unlikely source. Roche, the massive pharmaceutical company.
A pharmaceutical company bailed out an oil trading firm. Why?
Because Roche was absolutely flush with cash from selling the anti-anxiety drug Valium. So Valium money basically funds the rebirth of the company. They changed the name to Glencore, completely scrubbing Marc Rich from the brand. Meanwhile, Claude Dauphin, who had lost patience with Rich during the drawn-out negotiations, took his entire oil team and struck out on his own. He founded the rival trading giant Trafigura.
So two of the most powerful commodity firms in the world today, Glencore and Trafigura, were born directly from the ashes of Marc Rich's paranoia and a Valium-funded bailout.
Exactly. It is an unbelievable historical journey. We're talking about a handful of unknown individuals who started out with rotary telephones and telex machines, evolved to use complex financial derivatives, and literally rerouted the wealth of the entire world behind closed doors.
And it brings us right back to you, the listener. Every single time you interact with the modern economy, flipping a light switch, eating a piece of bread, driving a car, you are touching a supply chain that was built, maintained, and heavily profited upon by these relentless pioneers. It's completely invisible, but it is everywhere you look.
Which raises an important question to leave you with today. If these fiercely private, profit-driven companies wield enough power to save sovereign governments from bankruptcy, bypass international embargoes, and supply rebel armies with fuel, what happens when the next massive global crisis hits? When governments are paralyzed by bureaucracy, are we entirely dependent on the invisible, unaccountable hands of the commodity traders to keep the world running?
That is a very heavy thought to chew on the next time you're filling up your gas tank or buying a phone. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We'll be back soon with more, but until then, stay insanely curious.